twilight descended over Buckingham Palace, casting intricate patterns of shadow upon the marble floors. Only days had passed since the solemn funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, an event that united the nation in ceremonial mourning and showcased centuries-old pageantry at its height. Outside the gilded gates, wreaths and handwritten notes still lay in memory of a monarch who had reigned longer than most citizens had lived. International dignitaries had departed, flags had returned to full mast, and the public rituals of tribute drew to a close. Yet an uneasy stillness settled in. Behind the elegant facades, footmen and private secretaries navigated hushed corridors with a palpable tension. These staff members were no strangers to royal drama. They had witnessed fractious divorces, tabloid scandals, and even shifts in constitutional relationships with former colonies. However, the matter looming now felt more personal, more inwardly disruptive. The Queen had left a will. And while in ordinary families a will might elicit a flurry of predictable legal processes, in the royal family, it promised far greater reverberations. The monarchy's mystique thrived on tradition and secrecy. Over hundreds of years, royal wills were routinely sealed to the public, often for decades. Court officials and senior advisors alone would be granted access, discreetly distributing assets and personal keepsakes according to the sovereign's final instructions. In most eras, such an approach had been accepted, or at least not challenged. But this was the 21st century, an age of digital media, swift leaks, and a younger generation whose notions of legacy and transparency diverged significantly from those of a bygone royal order. The tension originated largely from a single question. Would Queen Elizabeth II's last testament address the controversies that plagued her final years, especially the departure of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle from active royal duties? Opinion polls suggested that the British public was split. Some believed Her Majesty would offer a conciliatory gesture to Harry, reaffirming his place in the family despite his self-imposed exile. Others predicted a far colder resolution, one that might effectively render him an outsider in official family records and finances. Rumors swirled online, in tabloids, and among royal correspondents who had long cultivated palace sources. For the staff working behind the scenes, it was impossible not to feel a ripple of dread. Suppose the Queen's will excluded Harry almost entirely. Would that ignite fresh claims that the monarchy was inherently unforgiving or even unwelcoming of change? Alternatively, if it bestowed a generous inheritance upon him, would that overshadow King Charles's ascension and perpetuate the controversies surrounding the Sussexes? These questions were no mere abstractions. They carried implications for the monarchy's long-term stability. That evening, King Charles held a quiet meeting with his key advisors in one of the palace's smaller drawing rooms, a departure from the grand settings normally favored for official gatherings. The room's walls displayed portraits of ancestors, monarchs who had navigated wars, religious schisms, and colonial expansions. Charles found himself reflecting on how they, too, must have contended with internal family rifts, albeit shielded by a much more deferential press. Now, no such shield existed. If the will's details became public, they could trigger a new wave of media frenzy, overshadowing the crucial early phase of his reign. In the corridors, liveried footmen carried silver trays of tea and correspondence, exchanging polite but terse nods. Even the palace's routine rhythms felt fraught with meaning. Many of these staffers had admired the Queen's ability to project calm amid chaos. Her stoicism was legendary. Yet stoicism had limits in the digital era, where speculation often outpaced official statements. As the evening deepened, the palace lights glowed with an almost reluctant radiance, illuminating a setting steeped in history but braced for uncertainty. Outside, beyond the ornate wrought iron gates, a cluster of photographers and camera crews maintained their vigil. They, too, sensed the hush that had descended since the funeral. At intervals, the subdued hum of traffic along the mall underscored the world's movement, while the monarchy seemed momentarily paused, like a grand production halted before a pivotal scene. In many ways, it was Everyone awaited the reading of the Queen's will, a private ceremony that promised to echo far beyond the palace's tightly monitored walls. To understand the gravity of this new chapter, one must grasp the tapestry of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. Crowned at a young age following her father's untimely passing, she represented continuity in a post-war world. She was the monarch who televised her coronation, turning an archaic rite into a modern spectacle. The figure who presided over decolonization, witnessing the transformation of the British Empire into a commonwealth of nations. The grandmotherly presence who comforted Britons after tragedies like the death of Princess Diana, 9/11, and various terrorist attacks on home soil. Through it all, she adhered to the bedrock principle of never complain, never explain. This motto shaped the monarchy's interactions with the media and the public, forging an image of dignified aloofness. Personal matters were rarely addressed in detail, even when the family found itself at the center of global scandals, be it divorces, affairs, or the more recent controversies surrounding Prince Andrew. Many within the institution regarded secrecy and restraint as essential pillars of the crown, safeguarding it from transient political headwinds. Yet, as Queen Elizabeth II grew older, the world changed ever more rapidly. Social media made privacy precarious. Tabloid culture reached unprecedented levels of intrusion, and younger royals, notably Harry and Meghan, sought a different approach. While the Queen understood the importance of incremental modernization, she participated in televised Christmas broadcasts, allowed behind-the-scenes documentaries, and engaged with the public on occasions. She maintained a distinct line that no one was to cross. The monarchy's internal decisions must remain cloaked in tradition and respect. Thus, it came as a shock to many when Prince Harry and Meghan Markle openly aired grievances about how the palace staff and senior family members handled issues of race, mental health, and tabloid harassment. Interviews with major broadcasters ignited a global dialogue about whether the monarchy, at its core, was too resistant to change. The Queen, attempting to preserve harmony, authorized a half-in, half-out arrangement at first, until the couple's swift departure, dubbed Megxit, forced the royal household to re-evaluate how effectively it could balance tradition with the unstoppable currents of the 21st century. When the Queen passed, these unresolved questions loomed. Would the monarchy double down on tradition, or could a new equilibrium be found, one more reflective of contemporary values? Her will became the ultimate cipher, a final statement that might either encourage reconciliation or punctuate the rift. With her gone, the monarchy had lost its most revered anchor. Everyone, from the king to the youngest staffer, felt the void of her steady presence. Yet it was the direct line of succession, Charles, William, and eventually George, that would bear responsibility for navigating whatever tumult arose. The days leading up to the scheduled reading of the Queen's will saw a near-constant barrage of stories in the press, fed by unnamed palace insiders and royal commentators. Some claimed the Queen had left Harry a notable inheritance, but with strict conditions, such as a legal stipulation that he refrain from further media exposés. Others theorized that she had bequeathed him only token items of sentimental value, reaffirming the monarchy's stance that privileges flowed chiefly to those who embraced active duty. On Twitter, Facebook, and emerging social platforms, hashtags like #RoyalWill, #QueenElizabethLegacy, and #Harry and Meghan Inheritors circulated. Users argued passionately about the monarchy's moral obligations. Defenders of the crown insisted that, by leaving, Harry had forfeited his right to a substantial claim on the Queen's personal estate. Critics countered that a grandmother's final testament should transcend institutional politics, reflecting love rather than duty. Major news channels dedicated entire segments to panel discussions, featuring a tapestry of voices. Historians referencing past royal successions, body language experts interpreting the family's interactions at the funeral, and legal scholars who explained the complexities of sealed wills. Some reminded viewers that the Queen's personal fortune, though significant, was distinct from the crown estate, which belonged to the nation. Yet such nuances were lost in the swirl of speculation. The public fixated on the personal drama, the most human element of a famously aloof family. Late-night talk shows added levity, lampooning the monarchy for its archaic pageantry while acknowledging the genuine emotional stakes. American audiences, particularly attuned to Meghan Markle's background, held conflicting feelings. Admiration for the institution's historic mystique clashed with disdain for what they viewed as an outdated, hierarchical system that might discard even a direct descendant. In the midst of this media clamor, Buckingham Palace maintained its official stance of decorous silence. Press officers released only the blandest statements, reiterating that the reading of any sovereign's will was a deeply private family matter. Yet that did little to quell the rumor mill. If anything, it fueled it. Seasoned royal correspondents noted that palace quiet often signaled important maneuvers behind the scenes, perhaps negotiations or, at minimum, consultations on how to manage the fallout once the will's contents inevitably leaked. Within the monarchy, these swirling narratives inspired anxiety. Staffers worried that an explosive revelation could overshadow the monarchy's broader role, conducting state business, leading charitable initiatives, and rallying public unity. The king's schedule included meetings with foreign ambassadors, speeches at environmental conferences, and receptions for civic leaders. Each event risked turning into a de facto press briefing on the will, overshadowing the monarchy's attempt to project stability. Even senior courtiers, those who had lived through crises like Charles and Diana's tumultuous separation, confessed they'd never seen such relentless, real-time speculation. To appreciate the stakes, it's critical to clarify the distinction between the Crown Estate and the Queen's personal assets. The Crown Estate, valued in the billions, was not Elizabeth II's to distribute. It belonged to the sovereign in trust for the nation, generating revenue that partly funded royal duties, with the remainder going to the treasury. The sovereign grant, derived from these profits, supported the Queen's, and now the King's, official expenditures. In contrast, the Queen had a substantial personal fortune. Over her lifetime, she accrued wealth from inheritances, investments, collections of art and jewelry, the Duchy of Lancaster, and personal estates like Balmoral and Sandringham, though those, too, had complicated histories of ownership. She also possessed smaller properties, antiques, thoroughbred horses, and an array of personal items that had been passed down through generations. Family photographs, diaries, and letters, often of historical import, were considered part of her private collection, though many were locked away from public view. Any bequest to Prince Harry, then, would come from this personal fortune. The monarchy's defenders argued that even if he received little or nothing monetarily, he wouldn't be destitute. He and Meghan had lucrative contracts and entrepreneurial ventures in North America. Others saw it differently. The inheritance symbolized more than material wealth. It represented the Queen's final word on Harry's standing in the family, whether or not she deemed him worthy of the privileges bestowed on those who remained in the firm. Amid these debates, legal experts weighed in, pointing out that centuries of tradition often directed the bulk of a monarch's personal wealth to the direct heir, ensuring that key assets and heirlooms stayed linked to the throne. Meanwhile, younger or non-heir relatives received smaller, but still notable legacies. This pattern held especially true for sovereigns concerned with preserving historical estates and maintaining the monarchy's sense of continuity. What complicated matters this time was the unprecedented scenario of a high-profile grandson who had openly broken from core duties, married an American celebrity, and publicly critiqued the institution. Palace aides remained tight-lipped, but insider gossip suggested the Queen's long-standing sense of duty might have steered her to reinforce the official line of succession. In that scenario, Prince William, and eventually Prince George, would receive the lion's share of any historically significant or financially critical properties. Harry's portion, if any, might be purely sentimental. Some aides insisted, however, that the Queen's personal affection for her grandson was deep, recalling how she had privately empathized with his struggles in the aftermath of Princess Diana's death. Was it possible that love could triumph over tradition in her final instructions? Thousands of miles away from Buckingham's stately corridors, Prince Harry awoke in the sunlight of California. A subtle hush enveloped his Montecito home, contrasting sharply with the media circus that swarmed London. His life had changed radically over the past 2 years. Instead of a medieval castle, he now resided in a modern estate with glass walls overlooking lush gardens. Paparazzi still lingered near the property, but the intensity paled compared to the relentless coverage he'd endured in Britain. Though physically distant, Harry found it impossible to escape the sense of foreboding that shrouded the monarchy. Friends and acquaintances bombarded him with messages about rumors. Informal updates trickled in from confidants still employed within the royal household. At times, he felt torn between curiosity and resignation. Did he want to know every detail floating around, or did that knowledge only deepen an emotional wound? Meghan Markle, for her part, immersed herself in philanthropic projects and her own media initiatives. She understood how fixated the world could become on every whisper about her and Harry. In public, she radiated calm and warmth, focusing on issues like paid parental leave, education, and women's empowerment. Privately, she struggled with the guilt of feeling that her presence had accelerated Harry's rift with his family. Though rationally she knew the monarchy's internal dynamics were complex, tabloids had simplified it into a singular narrative. Meghan as the outsider who encouraged Harry to rebel. In the quiet of their home office, the couple occasionally talked about what might happen once the Queen's will was unveiled. Harry vacillated between expecting nothing, since he had stepped back, and hoping for some symbolic acknowledgement that would reaffirm the bond he once shared with his grandmother. He recalled his childhood memories, chasing corgis through Balmoral's corridors, listening to the Queen's stories of her father, King George VI. These recollections clashed with the bitterness he felt about the monarchy's lack of empathy for Meghan's struggles. Meghan urged him to find a sense of acceptance, no matter the outcome. She reminded him that financial security was no longer an issue. They had film and podcast deals, brand partnerships, and philanthropic ventures. Emotionally, however, the bequest signified whether the Queen, even in death, recognized him as part of the fold. The question weighed heavily on Harry, a man shaped by both a deep loyalty to tradition and a burning desire to protect his wife from the fate that befell his mother. In moments of introspection, Harry wondered if physically returning to London for the reading might be worthwhile, a final chance to stand on familial ground. But the idea of stepping back into that charged environment, where every glance and gesture could be dissected, felt overwhelming. Moreover, he knew his presence could overshadow the actual event, feeding headlines about dramatic confrontations. So, he decided to remain in California, bracing himself for an inheritance that would either offer hope or confirm his fears. Back in London, King Charles was consumed by dual pressures, the official tasks of a new monarch and the private grief of losing his mother. Days were filled with ceremonial obligations, meeting prime ministers, accepting condolences from global leaders, attending receptions. Courtiers noted how he attempted to maintain the polished composure demanded by tradition, but glimpses of weariness occasionally showed. He recognized that the monarchy's continuity depended on demonstrating reassurance to a nation still grieving. Behind the scenes, Charles wrestled with how to handle the will's unveiling. He was not powerless, but tradition dictated that a monarch's personal testament was sacrosanct. Interfering, or even clarifying matters publicly, might be seen as undercutting the Queen's authority posthumously. Yet Charles also felt concern for Harry, his younger son. Their relationship had frayed with each new interview or revealing statement Harry and Meghan gave. The king wondered if a final rejection, if indeed the Queen's will withheld a significant inheritance, might permanently estrange Harry from the crown. That was an outcome Charles dreaded, conscious of how the public still remembered the painful wedge driven between him and Diana. Meanwhile, Prince William navigated his own labyrinth of conflicts. As the direct heir after Charles, he bore an increasing load of public engagements, from opening hospital wings to representing the monarchy at events his grandmother once presided over. He was popular with much of the British public, seen as a stable figure who might eventually modernize the crown in thoughtful increments. Nonetheless, he carried a palpable guilt about the chasm between himself and Harry. Both had endured the trauma of losing their mother. They had once been a united front against tabloid intrusion. Now, their paths diverged so drastically that it seemed improbable they would mend the bond without significant changes on either side. In quiet moments at Kensington Palace, William confided in Catherine about the upcoming reading of the will. They recognized that any slight toward Harry would inevitably become a media firestorm, reflecting poorly on the family. Yet how could William or Charles mitigate that outcome if the Queen's directives were already set in stone? Over cups of tea in their private living room, they debated the pros and cons of releasing a statement that expressed continued love for Harry, no matter what the will conveyed. But palace protocol was unyielding. Typically, the monarchy responded to crisis by saying as little as possible. Both Charles and William knew that a new wave of negative attention could erode the monarchy's public trust at a time when continuity was paramount. Polls already showed that younger Britons questioned the monarchy's role in a modern democracy. The royal family's philanthropic activities were overshadowed by sensational stories, fueling calls for a more transparent or even diminished monarchy. For the monarchy to endure, it would need unity, both within the family and in public perception. Yet the will's reading threatened to widen existing cracks, pushing father and son to question how best to honor the Queen's memory without sacrificing the family's fragile cohesion. Despite palace attempts at secrecy, word leaked that the Queen's will would be read in a private gathering at Buckingham Palace on a crisp autumn morning. The date and time were not officially announced, but the press stationed outside noticed an uptick in security activity. Plainclothes officers discreetly monitored traffic around the mall, while additional staff arrivals signaled preparations for an important event. At the designated hour, senior royals converged in a small, wood-paneled conference room seldom used for anything but the most serious matters. King Charles arrived first, flanked by legal advisors who carried sealed portfolios. Prince William and Catherine entered soon after, followed by Princess and Prince Edward and a handful of other close relatives. Though each wore an air of solemn composure, subtle cues betrayed heightened tension: clenched jaws, tight smiles, hurried whispers. As anticipated, Harry did not appear in person. Some had half expected him to slip in quietly, but a single glance at the rows of cameras outside the palace gates dispelled that notion. The monarchy's senior staff, from private secretaries to legal counselors, occupied one side of the long table. Family members took their seats on the other. After a brief introduction by the Queen's solicitor, a man with decades of experience handling royal affairs, the formal reading began. The text, at first, was dry and procedural. References to earlier legal precedents, testimonies to the Queen's sound mind at the time of signing, and confirmations of her identity. Then came the specifics. The Queen had distributed personal heirlooms among her children and grandchildren. Certain tiaras went to Princess, and, while a collection of antique furniture was allocated to Edward and Sophie, a portion of her private shares and holdings was placed into trusts earmarked for William and Catherine's children. Balmoral Castle, a cherished personal estate, was bequeathed directly to King Charles, reflecting centuries of tradition that the monarch maintains this beloved summer retreat. But when the solicitor reached Prince Harry, the atmosphere in the room tightened palpably. He was mentioned warmly, recognized for his military service, philanthropic efforts, and the joy he brought to Her Majesty over the years. The will assigned him a selection of personal mementos significant to their shared bond, but stopped short of any major financial provision. There was no mention of large estates, no extensive trust, no valuable art piece singled out. Instead, references to intangible keepsakes, letters, certain small items of sentimental worth, a modest but valuable brooch rumored to have once belonged to Queen Mary. The Queen's tone, unseen but heard through the solicitor's measured recitation, seemed neither punitive nor extravagant. To some family members, it felt like a compromise, acknowledging Harry's importance but reaffirming that the substantial wealth and crucial estates remained tied to the monarchy's direct line. Others found the statement heartbreakingly thin, as though it confirmed a wedge that could no longer be bridged. William kept his eyes on the table, expression unreadable. Charles occasionally cast a nervous glance around the room, but decorum demanded he remain impassive. The reading concluded with a few final stipulations regarding charitable donations and the fate of certain lesser-known properties. Then the solicitor closed the folder, and a hush engulfed the gathering. Even among those who had expected this outcome, the moment felt fraught. The monarchy, in effect, had once again underscored its prioritization of the direct heir, a stance that had preserved its continuity for centuries but risked alienating those who fell outside its scope of tradition. Within hours, the reading's essential details began appearing on news websites and in televised reports. While no official palace statement emerged, enough family and staff interactions had transpired, whispers exchanged, subtle remarks made, for journalists to piece together a near-complete picture. By nightfall, major outlets emblazoned headlines such as, "Harry left with keepsakes," "William gains bulk of estate." Tabloids speculated that the will signaled a final rift, describing the Queen's decision as an open snub. More measured broadsheets noted that historically, the direct heir usually inherited the lion's share. Still, the coverage emphasized the personal dimension, a grandmother apparently placing tradition above an estranged grandson's emotional connection. On social media, debate reached fever pitch. Hashtags like #HarryExcluded and #RoyalSnub soared in popularity. Some posts labeled the monarchy cruel, outdated, or incapable of empathy. Others defended the arrangement as standard royal practice, emphasizing that Harry had willingly stepped away from duties and financial entitlements. In the United States, where Harry and Meghan had garnered a sympathetic audience, talk shows denounced the monarchy's rigidity, while pro-royalist commentators insisted that personal wealth distribution was the Queen's prerogative. Outside Buckingham Palace, the media presence swelled. International correspondents from Europe, Asia, and the Americas joined British tabloids, all seeking angles to update the story every few hours. Briefings from the palace repeated a familiar refrain. The will was a private matter. The institution would not comment on speculation, and the king respected his mother's wishes. But such vagueness did little to appease hungry journalists or quell public curiosity. Meanwhile, corners of the UK gripped by cost-of-living concerns found the monarchy's internal disputes increasingly tone-deaf. Some questioned why such enormous wealth distribution, particularly in the form of hereditary estates, was relevant in the modern age. Calls for a public audit of the Crown's finances gained traction, though defenders argued that private inheritances should remain beyond government purview. In effect, the will's partial disclosure reignited simmering Republican sentiments, placing renewed scrutiny on the monarchy's place in British society. In California, Harry followed the news through trusted intermediaries. He had vowed not to obsessively check every headline, but it was impossible to avoid glimpses of the swirling commentary. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages, some from friends offering condolences, others from acquaintances fishing for a scoop. A BBC correspondent he'd once known personally reached out, hoping for an on-the-record reaction. He politely declined. Harry's immediate emotional reaction was a mixture of sadness and resignation. He had been ready for the possibility that the Queen would prioritize tradition over personal sentiment. Still, reading confirmations that his legacy amounted to mementos felt like a stark conclusion to decades of love and devotion. Memories of Sunday lunches at Windsor Castle, Christmas gatherings at Sandringham, and private jokes shared with the Queen ran through his mind. Meghan provided quiet support. She recognized how it must feel for Harry to see his grandmother's final gesture overshadowed by an unyielding institutional framework. Through all the global chatter, some praising them, others vilifying them, they leaned on each other. The swirl of external opinions could be suffocating, but they tried to keep perspective. Financial inheritance was less an issue than emotional closure. They still grieved that the monarchy had not found a way to offer a more affirming statement of acceptance. At night, after putting their children to bed, the couple sat on their patio under the California stars, discussing the next steps. Should Harry release a statement expressing gratitude for the personal items while reiterating love for his grandmother? Or would silence be the wisest approach, allowing the storm to pass on its own? His father and brother, shaped by the monarchy, might prefer silence. Yet Harry, who had grown more candid in recent years, felt uneasy about leaving the narrative entirely to the tabloids. Ultimately, he chose a middle path. Through a spokesperson, he issued a brief note thanking people for their condolences and expressing gratitude for Her Majesty's personal keepsakes that hold deep familial meaning. He refrained from criticizing or praising the broader inheritance allocations, thus neither inflaming nor diffusing the situation. Media outlets pounced on the statement's neutrality, spinning their own interpretations of a tacit acceptance or hidden hurt. In truth, Harry remained uncertain how to feel. While he had long come to terms with forging a life independent of royal coffers, the minimal inheritance signaled a harsh boundary between him and the monarchy's inner circle. As global headlines blared the perceived snub, King Charles retreated into the labyrinthine offices of Buckingham Palace, grappling with a deep sense of unease. Throughout his life, he had often felt overshadowed, first by a charismatic wife, then by a mother whose record-long reign left little breathing room. Now, as king, he faced an early test. Would the monarchy, in these sensitive times, reveal itself incapable of familial compassion? Charles thought back to private moments with his mother. Despite her stoic exterior, she had possessed a certain warmth. She taught him about the moral weight of the crown, the unspoken contract with the public, and the necessity of abiding by tradition to preserve the monarchy's symbolic role. He knew she likely felt torn about Harry, but her sense of duty took precedence, especially if she believed that acknowledging Harry's path in any major financial or material way might weaken the monarchy's hierarchical structure. Yet Charles's paternal instincts stirred. He remembered cradling Harry as a newborn, watching him run around Highgrove's gardens, praising him for his military achievements. The father in him wanted to reassure Harry that he remained loved, valued. But the king in him recognized that a direct override of the Queen's will could create an even greater uproar. He might be accused of disrespecting his mother's memory or playing favorites in a monarchy that thrived on formulaic continuity. Senior advisors offered divided counsel. The older, more traditional courtiers insisted that the monarchy had weathered bigger storms and that addressing personal controversies directly would only fan the flames. A younger cadre within the palace, a new generation of communication staff, proposed a different approach, a short statement acknowledging Harry's significance, to be released alongside the official notice that the will would remain sealed. Charles hovered between these options, torn by loyalty to the crown's unwritten rules and paternal concern for his son. Behind the palace's ornate curtains, the king embarked on a discreet attempt to contact Harry. It was not a formal invitation, nor did he intend to modify the will's terms. Rather, he wished to convey some reassurance, if only to mitigate the sense of finality. A private letter, penned in the king's distinctive script, expressed regret for the heartbreak and reiterated a father's love. He avoided criticizing the Queen's choices, framing them instead as decisions bound by the tapestry of our tradition. The letter, sealed and sent via a trusted courier, would hopefully reach Harry's Californian doorstep unimpeded by paparazzi. Whether or not that letter would thaw tensions was unknown, but Charles believed it was the least he could do. A paternal olive branch that might not solve the monarchy's deeper challenges, yet offered a glimmer of warmth in a moment overshadowed by institutional formality. In public, he remained silent, performing his duties with the stoicism his mother had modeled. In private, he wrestled with the knowledge that the monarchy's survival once again came at a painful familial cost. Prince William, meanwhile, found himself in a parallel predicament. He had long been cast as the monarchy's future, praised for balancing modern sensibilities with the dignity expected of a monarch in waiting. Public confidence in him and Catherine soared, aided by their relatable image. Children in tow, personal involvement in charities, and minimal scandal. Yet William carried the weight of knowing that the same system which groomed him for kingship had now seemingly sidelined his younger brother. In the days after the will's reading, William conducted standard engagements, visiting veterans associations, endorsing mental health campaigns, attending community events in rural counties. Cameras captured his every handshake, every exchange with citizens who politely asked about how the family was coping. He offered polite, non-committal answers. The paparazzi aimed for any moment that might hint at his true feelings. Some tabloids published photos of William looking pensive, with headlines suggesting regret over the Queen's harshness, even though no direct quote confirmed such sentiments. Privately, William wrestled with complex guilt. He was set to inherit the Duchy of Cornwall fully once his father became king, and eventually the Duchy of Lancaster as well, in addition to whatever wealth or estates the Queen had designated. By contrast, Harry's share was reduced to modest mementos. Did the disparity reflect a system that automatically valued one child's compliance over another's need for personal autonomy? During late-night conversations with Catherine, William considered whether to reach out to Harry. He recalled how, at their mother's funeral, they had walked solemnly behind Diana's coffin, bound by shared grief. Over time, media narratives and monarchy protocols had strained that solidarity. William was not blind to the fact that any public condemnation of the will's contents would be seen as a direct affront to the late Queen. Yet he yearned to remind Harry that their bond, though tested, was not irreversibly severed. One evening, he placed a private call to Harry's personal number. The conversation lasted less than half an hour, and sources close to them later described it as cautiously amicable. William expressed sympathy for how the inheritance details might sting emotionally, acknowledging the difficulties of grappling with family politics on a global stage. Harry appreciated the gesture, but remained guarded. Both recognized that their roles within the monarchy set them on divergent paths, and neither expected an overnight resolution. Even so, that call hinted at a faint hope for reconciliation. Though overshadowed by centuries of tradition and fueled by years of media-driven conflicts, the brotherly connection still flickered. For William, the moment underscored an uncomfortable truth. As he moved closer to the throne, he would need to embody the monarchy's sense of duty while also striving to adapt to a modern era that valued personal relationships more openly. Could he do both without sacrificing either tradition or compassion? Beyond the palace walls, the inheritance drama triggered a national and global reflection on the monarchy's continued relevance. Television interviews with activists, social media campaigns by political figures, and heated debates in university forums converged around a common theme. Did an institution that privileged primogeniture, secrecy, and rigid hierarchy still have a place in a rapidly evolving, egalitarian world? In Britain's parliament, a few outspoken MPs seized the opportunity to question the monarchy's financial arrangements. While there was no immediate push for a referendum, the conversation gained momentum in subtle ways. Younger voters, in particular, expressed skepticism. They pointed to the perceived harsh treatment of Harry as symptomatic of an institution unwilling to accommodate emotional or cultural shifts. Royal supporters countered that an unbroken line of succession was the monarchy's backbone. Compromising it for one member's personal journey could unravel the entire system. Commonwealth nations, too, found themselves revisiting questions about constitutional monarchy. In Canada, op-ed suggested that if the crown was prepared to ostracize a grandson, it might also be incapable of reflecting multicultural values. Australia's Republican movement noted a spike in interest. The monarchy's supporters in these nations, however, contended that local issues, not internal royal disputes, should determine whether ties to the crown remained beneficial. Meanwhile, mental health advocates used the moment to highlight how family estrangement, even at the highest levels of privilege, could be devastating. They argued that stony silence from the monarchy set a poor example for families coping with similar rifts in far less gilded circumstances. Harry's earlier openness about mental health struggles lent weight to this perspective. If the monarchy genuinely aimed to lead by service and compassion, critics reasoned it might need to modernize the way it handled personal crises. In contrast, Traditionalists insisted that the monarchy's purpose wasn't to mirror mainstream culture, but to exist above it, a unifying symbol that endured beyond personal disputes. The monarchy's ancient rituals, they argued, provided stability and continuity in an unstable world, and such intangible benefits outweighed occasional controversies. While they expressed sympathy for Harry, they deemed the Queen's approach consistent with centuries of unbroken practice. Caught in these cross-currents, the British public exhibited a range of responses. Some expressed ambivalence, finding themselves both sympathetic to Harry's plight and protective of a national institution that, for better or worse, shaped their identity. Others felt a boiling frustration at what they saw as an entrenched aristocracy that refused meaningful reform. This dynamic tension reflected not just a debate about a will, but an existential questioning of monarchy's role in a post-colonial, digital age. Throughout the furor over the Queen's will, Meghan Markle found herself again in the spotlight, albeit more peripherally than before. Tabloid narratives either cast her as a driving force behind Harry's estrangement or questioned whether she would urge him to fight the inheritance's meager terms. However, Meghan publicly maintained a low profile. She continued her philanthropic activities, partnering with nonprofit organizations to support women's education, entrepreneurship, and mental health initiatives. When pressed for comment, her team politely demurred. In certain segments of British media, speculation flared that Meghan was quietly celebrating the monarchy's discomfiture, having faced so much hostility in the UK press. Those closer to her dismissed this theory, describing how deeply she recognized Harry's pain and how fervently she wished for a more conciliatory resolution. Before they left Britain, Meghan had attempted to navigate palace protocol, but she often clashed with courtiers who favored a strict interpretation of hierarchical rules. On social media, a pro-Meghan contingent argued that the inheritance drama validated many of the criticisms she had voiced, that the monarchy might be capable of kindness privately, but institutionally it remained unyielding, even toward its own. Her detractors countered that Meghan had misread or disrespected centuries of tradition, forcing the monarchy into untenable positions. For Meghan herself, the question was not about proving who was right, but about supporting Harry as he reconciled his childhood memories of royal life with the harsh realities of being relegated to symbolic trinkets in his grandmother's final testament. She saw the potential heartbreak behind every tabloid story that called the inheritance a snub. No matter how stable their life in California became, Harry's connection to the monarchy was profoundly emotional. She reminded him that forging a meaningful future meant neither burying the past nor letting it dictate their sense of self-worth. Occasionally, the couple received messages from supporters within the palace, staffers sympathetic to their challenges, who believed the monarchy needed to adopt a warmer, more inclusive stance. Such messages, though small in scope, reaffirmed Meghan's belief that not everyone behind the gilded gates stood against them. Yet she also knew that ingrained customs, generational differences, and institutional inertia weighed heavily on how decisions were made. Shifting that tectonic plate seemed more formidable than ever, especially when the monarchy had just signaled its unwavering attachment to its line of succession. In the weeks after the reading, the public frenzy began to wane, overshadowed by new global headlines, political shakeups, economic concerns, and environmental crises. Still, the monarchy's internal gears turned, albeit quietly. King Charles's private letter to Harry reached Montecito, and while no official source confirmed its contents, those close to the couple hinted that it was earnest, reflecting a father's attempt at reassurance. Harry reportedly replied with a note of gratitude, brief, careful, and devoid of rancor. William also continued subtle outreach. Though their phone calls remained infrequent, each one chipped away at the glacial distance between the brothers. They avoided discussing the will in detail, focusing instead on everyday life, updates on children, shared memories of Diana, or innocuous jokes about the British weather. By tacit agreement, they left the heavy institutional matters alone. Neither felt fully equipped to fix a rift that was, in many ways, larger than either of them. For the monarchy's staff, these exchanges marked a possible thaw, but no one expected a dramatic public reunion. One high-ranking palace aide privately opined that the best outcome might be a quiet détente, with occasional family visits behind closed doors. And perhaps that was the monarchy's ideal scenario. No headline-grabbing reconciliation, no explicit condemnation of the Queen's choices, just a muted, incremental acceptance that Harry was forging his own path. Curiously, some British publications adopted a more sympathetic tone. Columnists who once critiqued Harry and Meghan relentlessly acknowledged that the inheritance outcome seemed uncomfortably stark. Biographers recalled how the Queen once doted on her young grandson, telling endearing stories of Harry's antics at Balmoral. Those recollections reminded readers of the family's genuine history of warmth, even if the monarchy's institutional demands ultimately overshadowed personal sentiment. Yet the monarchy did not openly revise or augment the will. No new statements indicated that Harry would receive more than the designated personal mementos. If King Charles offered any supplemental gift or trust, it occurred under the tightest secrecy. Observers noted that such secrecy aligned with the monarchy's time-honored approach: address problems discreetly, never publicly deviate from the official version. It was a technique that had once made sense in a more deferential society, but in the hyper-connected modern world, it frequently came across as evasive or cold. Despite the lessening of media fascination, many unresolved issues lingered in the air. Did this final testament truly reflect the Queen's personal feelings, or was it shaped by the monarchy's institutional guardians? How deeply was King Charles conflicted about continuing a tradition that placed dynasty over personal bonds? Would Prince William's eventual reign bring a different ethos, perhaps more lenient toward those who dare to walk a separate path? Courtiers returning to normal routines noticed subtle changes in the palace atmosphere. Some reported feeling unsettled, as though the Queen's final directive had peeled back the veneer of harmony. Staff conversations occasionally veered into contested territory. One might argue that Harry deserved more empathy, while another insisted loyalty must be rewarded. Where once the monarchy had been adept at presenting a united front, fractures now emerged not only in the family, but among the people who served them. Externally, the monarchy continued its ceremonial duties. King Charles led the traditional Remembrance Sunday service at the cenotaph, wreath in hand. William and Catherine toured local charities, receiving waves of adulation from crowds. Public life rolled onward, and for many Britons, the inheritance debacle became a footnote to more pressing concerns. Yet the monarchy's enduring challenge, balancing devotion to ritual with evolving societal values, remained unresolved. The question was whether the House of Windsor, in the wake of this inheritance crisis, might eventually adapt more thoroughly or retreat further behind established protocols. One late afternoon, as the sun set over the Buckingham Palace gardens, the hush of evening enveloped the manicured lawns and ancient trees. A hush reminiscent of that first twilight after the funeral, but now the weight of the will's revelation had settled. Courtiers hurrying through side entrances still wore expressions of careful neutrality, yet behind the composure, thoughts drifted to the personal cost of preserving the monarchy's mystique. Somewhere in the palace, King Charles reviewed briefing documents for an upcoming Commonwealth meeting, aware that echoes of his mother's final directives reverberated in calls for constitutional reassessment among member nations. Princess Anne, as stoic as ever, attended an equestrian event representing the monarchy's love of horses, an inheritance of passion from her mother. Prince Edward quietly continued philanthropic engagements, conscious that the monarchy's lifeblood lay in its capacity to serve. And William, in a private moment, observed his children playing on palace grounds, imagining the day one of them would stand poised to inherit the crown under circumstances shaped by decisions made centuries, if not decades, prior. In California, a parallel hush fell as Harry and Meghan put their children to bed. The orchard trees on their property swayed gently in the Pacific breeze. Sometimes Harry recalled the stately garden parties at Buckingham, Whereas a child, he'd marveled at the lavish decor and the seemingly unbreakable walls of tradition. Now, he found meaning in simpler joys, family dinners without ceremony, philanthropic work that welcomed frank dialogue, and a lifestyle free from the stifling protocols that once defined his existence. Still, the monarchy lingered in his dreams and recollections, an ever-present reminder of what he had left behind and what might never be fully reconciled. Beyond personal choices and family affection, the monarchy stood at a crossroads mapped out by the late Queen's final statement. She had reigned through eras of tumult, always guided by the principle that duty must overshadow personal whim. In her testament, that principle held firm, granting key assets to the direct line and leaving the rest to accept or depart from tradition as they willed. If this stance seemed harsh in a world hungry for gestures of empathy, it also testified to an institutional logic older than any one generation. And yet, in every parted family, threads of common memory remain. Even as the monarchy projected continuity, it could not sever the intangible ties of personal history. Perhaps in the quiet corners of future years, Harry might stand in the palace gardens once more, invited by Charles or William for an intimate gathering. Perhaps they would share laughter recalling pranks, or kneel together to greet new corgis. Or perhaps that moment would never come. The bond, too, strained by an inheritance that became symbolic of deeper fractures. For now, life continued, and so did the monarchy, resilient, criticized, fascinating, enduring. The House of Windsor had once again demonstrated its commitment to lineage over all else, affirming an ethos that many considered archaic, yet still mesmerizing to global audiences. Time would tell whether this choice preserved the monarchy or sowed seeds for further discord. In that garden twilight, the last shadows of day seemed to whisper that the story was not yet done unfolding. Each new dawn would bring opportunities for small reconciliations or deeper entrenchments in a family saga that, for all its grandeur, remained achingly human.